Dziękuję bardzo. Serdecznie wobec tego zapraszam tutaj do nas pana profesora Wolframa Kaisera. Troszeczkę jesteśmy, ponieważ, że tak powiem, przykrym obowiązkiem prowadzącego każdą sesję, także moim niestety, jest pilnowanie dyscypliny czasowej, a już jesteśmy jakieś 15 minut za naszym planem. Tak jak patrzę tutaj na godzinę, to nie znaczy oczywiście, że chciałbym ograniczać tutaj pana profesora w jego wykładzie wprowadzającym, ale ograniczę po prostu samego siebie i wszyscy mamy przed sobą materiały konferencyjne. Tam jest bardziej dokładny biogram pana profesora. Ja tylko powiem, że pan profesor jest profesorem studiów europejskich na Uniwersytecie w Portsmouth i profesorem visiting professor w Kolegium Europejskim w Brugi. I zaoferował nam on dzisiaj wykład wprowadzający, dotyczący głównie tego, jak należy badać chrześcijańską demokrację współcześnie, czym jest jakby temat chrześcijańskiej demokracji we współczesnej historiografii europejskiej i jak się zdołamy przekonać, pewnie za chwilę pan profesor chciał tutaj zapoczątkować dyskusję, do której zachęcam po jego wystąpieniu. Bardzo proszę, panie profesorze, że tak się wyrażę, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you also for keeping it as short as possible so that I can use my 30 minutes that I've been allocated for my lecture. German academics normally start their presentation with an excuse. I have worked in the United Kingdom for too long to bother with this particular tradition. I only have one disclaimer. If you do not like what you hear, you only have to blame me for that. Actually, the organizers initially asked me to talk about Christian democracy and European integration in the 20th century. This was, I believe, because of my work on the transnational networking of Christian democratic parties and its impact on the informal politics of what is now the European Union, a book that was published with Cambridge University Press in 2007 already. However, it tries to look at the last 120, 140 years or so of Catholic and Christian democratic networking across borders in Europe and its impact on politics and policy coordination, particularly with a focus on the post-1945 European integration process. This book also includes some references, at least, to the East Central European exile, including from Poland in London during the Second World War, and also to the exclusion of exiles, for example, from the Basque Country from Western European party networking in conjunction with the formation of core Europe, the core Europe of the present-day European Union after 1945. I suggested the actual topic of my presentation today for one simple reason. This is that I believe that the history of Christian democracy in 20th century Europe as a research field in modern and contemporary history, is currently in a profound crisis. A crisis that is reflected in the increasingly marginal role of such research and funded research on Christian democracy in particular in the larger historiography of modern Europe. In the following, I will suggest what I think are a few structural and academic causes of this crisis. I am doing this from the position of an outsider of sorts. I'm not a member of a Christian Democratic Party, or for that matter, any political party. I have not had a formal affiliation with any of the great institutions such as the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the KADOK, or the Istituto Luigi Sturzo, which have fostered research on Christian democracy in the past and are thankfully continuing to do so. And I work in a country with a marginal intellectual tradition of Catholic social thought and no Christian Democratic Party tradition at all. I do not think, however, that the situation is entirely hopeless for the patient. I will therefore try in the second part of my lecture to suggest some structural reforms and a set of research themes which might yet facilitate a new renaissance of research on the history of Christian democracy and perhaps more generally of European political ideology and party history. Historical research is closely bound to and influenced by contemporary socio-economic and political trends. One of these trends has been the relative decline in many Western European countries of Christian democratic parties as a first structural reason for the crisis of our research field. The erosion of the Catholic milieu and the decline in lifelong party allegiance among voters hit political parties such as the Dutch Catholic People's Party increasingly hard from the mid-1960s onwards. After the merger with two Protestant parties in the 1970s, the Christian Democratic Appeal only received a meager 8.5% of the vote in the Dutch elections in 2012. In France, the Mouvement Républicain Populaire, a key centrist party and supporter of European integration, collapsed under pressure from Gaullism in the mid-1960s. Christian democracy from then onwards formed only one part of the highly volatile centrist and center-right political formations in France. In Italy, the Christian Democrats, highly fragmented internally into Catholic Action, liberal conservatives, and left Catholics, seemed the natural party of government until it disintegrated in the early 1990s, with successor parties forming appendices on the right of the left and the left of the right as the new similarly internally fragmented blocs in Italian politics emerged. Sorry. True. The end of the Cold War facilitated the successful expansion of the European People's Party, formed in 1976, into the future East Central European member states of the European Union, including, of course, Poland. Despite initial challenges to identify appropriate partners in the volatile new party systems, this has helped the EPP consolidate its strong position in the European Parliament, where it has now been the strongest parliamentary party since 1999. Some of the new EU member states, like Poland, had traditions of Christian democracy of sorts dating back to before the war and persisting to some extent during the Cold War period, when they provided one important focal point of criticism of and opposition to the communist regime. Moreover, after the experience of 45 years of Soviet occupation, strong anti-socialist attitudes prevailed for the most part. Nevertheless, with few exceptions, distinctive Christian democratic parties did not emerge. In Poland, the division into a pro-European centrist People's Party and a nationalist Catholic right has actually made a unification of Christian-inspired political groups in one political formation impossible, creating, as I understand it, something of a political minefield for researchers associated with institutions like this university, which is kindly hosting the conference. The decline of Christian democratic parties and of the Christian democratic core in broadly based people's parties has naturally led to reduced academic interest in them and in their history. The economic and financial crisis in the European Union and the growth of populist Eurosceptic parties has aggravated the situation further. Research on Euroscepticism and Eurosceptic parties is mushrooming and often well funded by European Union and national funding bodies. They are keen to identify the sources of this phenomenon, which has potential to disrupt the European Union and even to undermine the membership of some countries in it. At the same time, funding for research into the history of Christian democracy by institutions affiliated with Christian democratic parties has declined. The Catholic Documentation Center in Nijmegen in the Netherlands is a case in point. With the university hosting it having deleted the Catholic denomination from its title, I think 8 years or so ago, it has come under pressure to reinvent itself with sharply reduced funding. This in turn seems to have led to a broadening of its focus on Catholicism, but with much less attention paid to party history and European connections than before. Research on Christian democracy, as a result, appears to depend even more on the few institutions that have formed Civitas, and especially on the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and its strong role for historical reasons as one of the major political foundations in Germany. The second structural reason for the crisis, in my view, is precisely that research on the history of Christian democracy in the past was perhaps too closely affiliated with and dependent on institutions with close links to the Christian democratic parties. In post-war Western Europe, modern and contemporary history as a research field was much more highly party politicized than it is now. Political parties and affiliated institutions began to organize research on their own history, normally conducted by historians who were members of that party or at least close to it politically. In some countries like Belgium, the Versäulung or pillarization of society along political and language lines extended to universities and academics working within them. In others, like Western Germany, political preferences were closely associated with major historiographical schools. Gesellschaftsgeschichte or societal history was the domain of social democratic and left liberal historians. Political and diplomatic history was largely done by historians affiliated with the Christian Democrats, broadly speaking. Academic networks built on such pillars and schools and dominated recruitment of researchers and professors. Much of the historical research on political Catholicism, Christian democracy, and Christian democratic parties was highly politicized as a result. It was often characterized by navel-gazing with critical outside-in perspectives by independent historians without some form of party affiliation, including some British and American colleagues, deliberately marginalized. In Germany, for example, Frank Bösch published a challenging book on the Christian Democratic Union, including the critical issue of its funding operations during the Adenauer period, but its reception was largely limited to more left-wing historians. My British colleague Martin Conway, in turn, rightly or wrongly, felt marginalized in Belgium with his work on Belgian political Catholicism and the affiliation of its right wing with authoritarian fascist groups and parties, and on continuities across the Second World War. Some work by Christian Democrats on Christian democracy has even had autobiographical traits, as of course in Helmut Kohl's doctoral thesis on the origins of the Christian Democratic Union in Rhineland-Palatinate. More recently, in the field of Christian democracy, international cooperation, and European integration, Roberto Papini's work has been similarly characterized by a fusion of activist experience, attempts at historical reconstruction, and the propagation of a particular Christian democratic European and international vocation. As a result, the dividing line between professional historical research and what I would call the preservation of party heritage has often been blurred. The European vocation of Christian democracy is a case in point. The lack of cooperation, for the moment at least, as I understand it, of the Munich-based Hans Seidel Foundation, affiliated with the Christian Social Union with Civitas, reflects traditional fault lines in German politics going back to Bad Kreuth in 1974 and beyond, and the conflicts at the time over the creation of the European People's Party and the European Christian Democratic Union during the second half of the 1970s. To some extent, at least, these conflicts have been and still are also about what kind of Europe Christian Democrats want and how to use research as one weak, but perhaps not entirely irrelevant factor to promote a particular identity and vision for Christian democracy. Fewer and fewer historians see their role as contributing to the promotion of party heritage and parties' electoral success, however. As in the rest of society, fewer academics are now party members or have strong party affiliations. Academic evaluation criteria have changed rapidly, especially in Northern Europe, where external funding and international networks and publications increasingly influence hiring, recognition, and pay. At the same time, the growth of cultural history and of the so-called new political history, which is less focused on institutions and decision-making, have marginalized research on political parties, their ideological development, and political action. It has become increasingly clear that, with some notable exceptions, research on the history of Christian democracy for far too long has been nationally introspective, often even lacking a merely implicit comparative perspective. Now that the Christian democratic academic milieu has eroded just like that of other political groups and parties, it becomes clear to what extent research on the history of Christian democracy has taken place in something that I would call, slightly provocatively, an academic greenhouse. Conducting research in an academic greenhouse, however, has caused intellectual problems in the past. The similarly pillarized research on socialism has been more organically embedded in a larger field that has encompassed other social groups and actors like the history of the working class and of the trade unions. Moreover, this research has drawn upon social and societal history and its concepts and methods. The resulting orientation induced other forms of seclusion and introspection, but it has helped the history of socialist ideas, parties, and movements to become more organically linked into other research and, importantly, to profit from theoretical and conceptual debates in modern history. Research on Christian democracy, in contrast, has been more loosely linked to the history of ideas and political history. As far as I can see, however, it has often reconstructed the ideas of Jacques Maritain and others as largely self-contained in an older history of ideas approach, something that I would say is perhaps appropriate for theological research or philosophical research, but without sufficiently placing their evolution in their social context of social transformations, ideological and party competition, and transnational transfers. At the same time, the highly state-centric older political history focused for too long on state institutions and their decision-making, which apparently did not require the careful study of domestic political forces and political motivations. That approach, where foreign relations are explained with social change, economic interest, and domestic political competition, was best left to Marxists. Work on Christian democracy thus has not really interacted sufficiently with new theoretical, conceptual, and methodological developments in modern history as a discipline. Moreover, the secluded character of much of the research on the history of Christian democracy and the lack of networks with the Anglo-Saxon world, where no such party tradition exists after all, has also greatly complicated the internationalization of this research field. 15 years ago, Michael Gehler, Helmut Wohnut, and I were unable, despite several approaches to various colleagues in the French language, to recruit a single French academic to attend our conference in Vienna on European Christian democracy. This despite the fact that they could have given their paper and contributed to the conference in French, and we merely hoped that they might conceivably understand the papers in English and perhaps to some extent in German. This was not a realistic expectation, however, and we ended up recruiting 2 colleagues for the resulting book only, which did not require communication in languages other than French. This situation has improved somewhat since then. However, as this conference perhaps also shows, it remains challenging in the history of Christian democracy as a research field to communicate with ease in one or more European languages, or even just in English. In the past, historians working in Britain or North America have made major contributions to our understanding of Christian democracy in a more or less pan-European perspective. This includes, but is not limited to, Stathis Kaliva's political science work with an empirical focus on the origins of Christian democracy, Martin Conway's research on political Catholicism and democracy, and my own work perhaps on party networks and European integration in long-term historical perspective. This research has contributed to the slow and in some ways paradoxical spread of English, because it's not really required for research on continental European Christian democracy, as the lingua franca of research on Christian democracy alongside the partial use of Spanish in the Americas. Integrating research on the history of Christian democracy conducted elsewhere and in other languages more organically into the field of modern history, which is in the process of internationalization, now appears to depend on the use of English for communication and publication. And the problem is, however, that this is often done in a half-hearted and less than competent manner. Publication is often with third-rate publishers like Peter Lang, for example, which publish anything for a sufficient subsidy, which doesn't mean that some of the books published with the publisher are not very good, but that's the general principle of the publisher. Manuscripts are frequently unedited or badly edited, and the quality of the English is often even more disastrous than that of my British students. Book chapters often recycle work published 20 years earlier in another European language, and these academic chapters are preceded by congratulatory opening speeches by retired Christian democratic politicians and functionaries whose main interest, more often than not, is in their party's heritage or even just their personal legacy, understandable as this may be. When you look at the 2 volumes on Christian democratic internationalism edited by Jean-Dominique Durand and published with Peter Lang, I think in 2013, which I recently had to review, you might be forgiven for thinking that I've just described them. This is a more widespread disease, I would say, in the historiography of Christian democracy, however. Such books have no impact, they contribute nothing to the state of the art, and they actually make sure that the research field will remain marginalized in modern history in times of more and more comparative transnational and global approaches to understanding the world we live in. What to do? For what it may be worth, I have a number of suggestions for structural reforms and for conceptual and thematic innovation, which can perhaps help us overcome the crisis of the field. I make these suggestions as an outsider of sorts, but with a strong interest in the survival and strengthening of supportive structures for research on the history of Christian democracy and in the history of Christian democracy broadly conceived. It seems to me that the research field of Christian democracy has for a long time reproduced the siege mentality that has characterized Catholicism, political Catholicism in Europe for much of the last 150 years. This mentality characterizes, to begin with, the conflict lines within Christianity and its political forms of organization which have affected research on Christian democracy. At the most general level, this concerns the relationship between Catholicism and Protestantism and associated political groups. Thus, the particular focus on Christian democracy with its roots in Catholic social teaching and its loosely associated preference for the creation and deepening of a continental core Europe with somewhat supranational features has made it difficult to look beyond its cultural boundaries, including to the evangelical Euroscepticism, which to some extent and in various ways characterized Christian parties in Scandinavia for a long time, and conservative and Labour Party attitudes to European integration in Britain, leaving aside for the moment the violent anti-Catholicism of the Ulster Unionists around Ian Paisley directed against Irish nationalists and the European Union as an allegedly Roman Catholic project alike. In a broader conception of the history of Christian forms of democracy, however, we should surely take these intellectual and political traditions, forms of political organization and activity, and relations with political Catholicism into account. Below the confessional level, however, I also see traces of the siege mentality in attempts to retain a strong, if not exclusive, research focus on apparently pure forms of Christian democracy and on a form of Europeanism associated with the Christian democratic so-called founding fathers of the European Union, including Adenauer, Schuman, and de Gasperi. This still appears to be one of several motives for the frequent non-cooperation between the Adenauer Foundation and the Seidel Foundation, which goes back to their conflicts over the ideal sister parties in the transition in Spain and Portugal in the 1970s, and similarly, I think, in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, as well as the formation and orientation of the European People's Party. For research on the history of Christian democracy, however, such political fault lines create very unhelpful divisions and make the research field even more marginal than it already is. More cooperation among partners with substantial resources could only strengthen the field and assist its greater integration into mainstream history. The Catholic siege mentality also informs attitudes to research on the history of other political traditions, ideologies, and parties. It would be desirable, however, to see more research in a comparative or transnational perspective on the relations of Christian democracy with socialism and socialist political parties in particular, from their competition for the allegiance of the working class through to their cooperation in so-called grand coalitions, cooperation that has, after all, characterized the work of the European Parliament since its inception, but also the politics of many Western European countries like Austria or Central European countries like Austria, and presently even Germany, of course. True, a few individual researchers have sought to tackle related topics, like Peter van Kemseke in his study of the globalization of socialism and Christian democracy in the first 20 years after the Second World War. At the institutional level, however, it is my impression that organized socialism has been slightly more adventurous, perhaps, in facilitating comparative perspectives, and perhaps precisely because of its association with societal history, which has fostered comparison as a historical method. One final suggestion for structural reforms on which Civitas has already been working, closer cooperation among archives that hold relevant sources relating to Christian democracy and Christian democratic parties, would be highly valuable for researchers. Most archives now have user-friendly access rules. During the work for my Cambridge University Press book, I still experienced in some archives in some countries privileged access being given to in-house researchers or those with strong party affiliations, sometimes under the pretext that sources had not yet been organized. Such plainly unethical behavior naturally undermines attempts at attracting young researchers and integrating research on the history of Christian democracy more into mainstream modern history. In this context, I would also hope that Civitas could act as a lobby for a change in the Vatican's archival policies, which are frankly embarrassing. We will soon now, we know this I think for the last 4 weeks or so, we will soon be able to access sources on the Pope's role during the Argentinian junta period in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but we will still not be able to utilize material related to far less contentious issues in the same period. Thus, I have just co-edited the book on international organizations and environmental protection in the 20th century, which includes an interesting chapter by an Italian colleague, Luigi Piccioni, on the ambivalent policy of the Holy See towards the United Nations 1972 Stockholm Conference. For his chapter, however, he had to rely entirely on media reporting and accessible private papers as long as the Vatican archives are not open. I understand, of course, that financial constraints can impede cooperation among archives. Still, such cooperation can go further than facilitating access to sources in the archives themselves. Putting more and more sources on the internet and linking them electronically across archives could, in my view, be a medium-term objective. In addition, as far as I can see, research on the history of Christian democracy lacks a systematic approach to conducting and collecting interviews with eyewitnesses. Some interview material is available through cooperation of historians with other institutions. Hans-Jürgen Küsters made a start with his project and book on the founding of the European Economic Community more than 30 years ago. Michael Gehler similarly has conducted several interviews that are relevant to the history of Christian democracy. The European institutions' own heritage policies help conduct and collect interviews now accessible on the homepage of the Historical Archives in Florence, some of which are also relevant to our interests. But this material seems to be very scattered and difficult to retrieve and use for historians. The suggested structural changes could make a major contribution to developing new intellectual agendas for research on the history of Christian democracy. I would suggest that one way forward would be for some of this research to connect better with the new history of ideas. Catholic researchers sometimes seem to believe that confessional and political ideas emerge from divine inspiration and within a closed environment in which they circulate. I have always found that Marxists understand better than Catholics that political ideas largely depend on changing socio-economic circumstances, the competition with other ideas and political groups, whether authoritarian and fascist on the right in interwar Europe or socialist and communist on the left then and now. Secularization processes too have demanded new answers from Christian Democrats which range from foregoing the use of Catholic or Christian in the French MLP's party name to the debate about the meaning, if any, of the so-called capital C in the CDU's party name. Another way forward could be to discuss Christian democracy as a heterogeneous web or part of such a web of actors and institutions. In his work on the Catholic Black International, Emil Lambert sought to map predominantly aristocratic Catholic connections during the late 19th century culture wars. Patrick Pasteur, who's here with us, of course, has looked at Christian trade unions and their search for a third way from a European perspective. To the best of my knowledge, however, much less work has been done across different actors from the Holy See to Christian democratic parties and trade unions. While we have a fairly good idea of the role of Christian beliefs and Christian democratic actors in the origins and evolution of the European Union, we know next to nothing about their contribution to the work of other international organizations, for example, in the case of the environment and development policies mentioned above. With the current Pope having advocated 3 children as the ideal maximum number, perhaps surprising for some in this country particularly, we might be tempted to forget that Catholic policies on birth control once had a significant effect on national and international policies, as well as social developments on the ground across the world. Linked to the suggestion for more research cutting across the different small worlds of Christian democracy is my plea for research on the transfer of ideas and practices, which has only been conducted in the most rudimentary way so far as I can see. Conceptually, such research on transfers has now been developed in early modern and modern history for more than 25 years at least, but with little impact on research on Christian democracy, with some prominent exceptions. How have political ideas traveled from other political ideologies and groups into Christian democracy loosely defined and within Christian democracy across the borders of regions and countries? How have its practices been shaped by experiences elsewhere and influenced them in turn? For example, in my research, I frequently come across learning processes among Christian democratic parties regarding modern forms of electoral campaigning, before some of them began to borrow more from American practices. However, no one seems to have taken this up as a research topic so far. Let us not forget that either Christian Democrats have been active at more than the EU and national levels of parliamentary politics and government. Christian democratic networks may also have facilitated the formation of networks and exchange relations at the level of regional and local government in Europe, especially in processes of transition to democracy, as on the Iberian Peninsula in the 1970s and in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Tackling these and other research themes requires broad historical background knowledge and language skills. In many cases, it can probably only be done in research teams, something that is now beginning to be practiced more widely in modern history. This approach, of course, has its pitfalls, especially when it comes to writing up the research results. However, it has more potential, including for obtaining funding, than, to put it provocatively, conferences with friends of Christian democracy, resulting in incoherent edited books with chapters whose intellectual horizon ends on the borders of Christian democracy or those of the author's country and national specialization. I'm glad to say that this particular conference seeks to connect to such broader themes and debates. In Western and Northwestern Europe, we are sometimes, unfortunately, tempted to think, like Neville Chamberlain in 1938, that the more we travel east and southeast in Europe, the less we know, and the less we can perhaps learn. Actually, the reverse may be true, because in Poland you have been disconnected from the friendly circles which have researched and propagated what I have called pure Christian democracy. You may well find it easier to develop and insert innovative ideas and approaches into changing networks and research themes. In fact, this may well be reflected in the choice of two eminent historians for the next panel, with their broad global orientation, including work on North America and Sino-European relations in the case of Patrick Pasture, and the Cold War and European integration history in the case of Antonio Vasori. Profiles and interests that facilitate the outside-in perspective, which I believe is absolutely crucial to injecting new life into the history of Christian democracy as a research field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaiser. Szanowni Państwo, wobec tego otwieram dyskusję. Jak już powiedziałem, troszeczkę nam się czas, że tak się wyrażę, przesunął, ale nie będę tej dyskusji blokował. Planowaliśmy pół godziny na tą dyskusję, która jest dyskusją jakby otwierającą. Pan profesor Kaiser postawił już w swoim wystąpieniu szereg pytań, szereg wątpliwości, szereg problemów, które być może na pewno stoją badacze zajmujący się chrześcijańską demokracją, ale być może w ogóle historycy w dzisiejszych czasach. Także nie przedłużając, otwieram dyskusję. Proszę bardzo, i też chciałbym jeszcze ze względów technicznych przypomnieć i poprosić wszystkich zabierających głos o przedstawianie się. Wszyscy się podpisywaliśmy na zgodach o wykorzystanie naszego wizerunku w trakcie konferencji. W związku z tym dobrze byłoby, żeby ludzie, którzy będą w przyszłości oglądać nasze wizerunki w internecie, mogli wiedzieć, kto mówi i o co konkretnie pyta. Także to tyle, jeżeli chodzi o moje krótkie wprowadzenie. Otwieram dyskusję. Proszę bardzo. Pan premier Czarnogórski chciałby zabrać głos.
Thank you. I would like just to add to the list of publications on Christian democracy we have heard the book by Slovak author Vladimir Palko, and German translation has appeared maybe 1 year ago. The Lions Are Coming. It is from picture from old Rome when Christians were thrown to the lions in the arena, and it is the book, yes, criticizing the too much compromises of not only Western Europe, even Central European new Christian democratic parties to the liberal ideology that is governing in the last decades. So the German title is Die Löwen kommen, and yes, I recommend the book. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę bardzo.
Thank you, Wolfram, for this very interesting overview.
And,
Oh, Patrick Pasture. Yeah. I agree with most of what you said. Apart from one thing, I think the story of party politics, history of party politics in crisis, you hear that at all kind of conferences about other political families as well. I'm quite familiar with labor history, as you know. Well, the same almost lamentations you hear exactly in almost the same words. Just substitute Christian democracy with socialism, and you end up the same. And they look sometimes with the same envy to what happens at the Christian democratic side. And there is also a kind of similarity. So I think all kind of party political histories are in crisis, and you know that as well. Also, European integration history suffers from very much the same kind of problems. I think you could make an interesting parallel there, and of course the historiography of Christian democracy and European integration offers from this double crisis in some sort. But I have a question for you, which is a little bit different but related, and that may be an opening, an opportunity for the research on the history of Christian democracy. Today we see that the whole issue of religion in the public sphere is very much present, and I think there might be opportunities to revisit the history of Christian democracy, of political Catholicism and so forth, from that perspective as well. And I would like to hear a bit more from you on that subject, which I missed somehow in your presentation.
Dziękuję bardzo. Okay.
Piotr Kosicki. Thank you very much for the lecture. I couldn't agree more, and I'm delighted with so much of what you said, particularly because I have a chapter in one of the volumes that you mentioned, and I'm always afraid no one is going to read it, even though I put quite a bit of time into it, and it wasn't something I published 20 years ago. But I have two questions for you. One, I'm going to push a little bit in terms of what you think the possible trajectories might be for practical research cooperation, and then the other is more conceptual. It strikes me, and this is maybe a different version of the comment that Patrick Pasture made a second ago, which is that just as we can think across different party political cultures in crisis. It seems to me that, particularly coming from the American side of research, something that's really changed in the past 10, 15 years is that there's an emerging critical history of transnational Catholicism writ large, not just in the sense of political Catholicism, but Catholic intellectual, social, and political transfers across borders. I'm part of a generation, I think, that represents that kind of a shift. And I'm curious, just because that didn't really come up in the context of your remarks, if you feel like, in addition to crossing political boundaries, it may be as productive or even more productive to make that leap into what you call the new history of ideas, in the sense that there's a critical engagement with Catholicism more generally that can then reframe what you described as the Catholic siege mentality. The second is, maybe this is just a wishful thinking question. funding is an issue, right? We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Where do we get our money if we don't go to the old institutions that have traditionally sponsored Christian democratic research into Christian democracy, right? And I like the idea of looking to new places, and I think this conference is hopefully a very good example of the sort of cooperation that might work. But would you suggest EU grants? What do you think is? I'm obviously, you know, we're scholars, not bureaucrats, but I'm just curious, what do you think that holds the most promise in terms of a practical organization, right? Would you put together a scholar of socialism, a scholar of Catholic religious ideas, a scholar of religion in the public sphere, maybe, you know, Catholic-Muslim relations, and then a scholar of Christian democracy, and create teams like that in order to avoid sort of this repeated sort of reversion to straight Christian democratic scholarship? I'm just curious what you think one possible model might be. Thanks.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Well, Antonio Versuri, and well, I appreciate very much, you know, Wolfram Kaiser paper, and I mostly agree with his comments. But I think that also what Patrick said was right. I mean, at every conference, you know, I listen to the crisis of history, and I wonder, and I would like to go, you know, a bit further, you know, what you said. I mean, I completely agree. There is a crisis in, I mean, the approach towards political history in general and the history of political parties. Well, and it's obvious if we think about the disintegration of most traditional political parties everywhere in Europe, you know. And, but I will say that especially from an international viewpoint, because we are mostly interested in the international dimension, you know. Well, of course, we are interested in the, I mean, the history of the German Christian Democrats and so on, but we are interested more in the interaction among the different Christian Democrat actors. Don't you think there is a general crisis of international history, especially history international relations as such, you know. We spent, most of us, you know, you, myself, and other, you know, colleagues here and elsewhere, most of our time studying two main topics, you know, during the last 20, 25, 30 years, Cold War and European integration. And I got the impression that, well, there is some sort of disappointment towards both, you know, approach. Cold War, I mean, Cold War is still interesting, but from my experience, we have more and more difficulties in finding out new topics, you know. And now, so we are just focusing our attention in small cultural phenomena in the Cold War, you know, or the small Third World War country and the Cold War. And as far as the European integration, which is more or less the topic of our conference, I got the same impression, you know. There is some sort of disappointment, you know. I have some problems in finding out the reason why we are so tired, you know, with these two different approaches. Why, on the contrary, you know, also at the level of the European Union, everybody seems to be interested only in what is happening today, at the most tomorrow, but not about our past. Our past doesn't matter, you know. We can build the European construction, we can do everything without knowing what we are, you know. Think about the attitude of the European Union and also about the European Union institution towards the history, not only the history of the European institution, but also European history as such, you know. It's so scant, you know, this interest. They're interested in what we are doing now, you know, what we are doing tomorrow. But what about the past? Never mind. It doesn't matter. I don't know, but I would like to have your opinion about that.
Thank you very much. Any more questions or comments? Jakieś pytania jeszcze? Komentarze? Okay. It's time to answer the questions, and well, the floor is goes.
Sorry, does it work now? Yeah?
I think it works.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for these very interesting and challenging questions. First of all, Patrick, of course, I tried to make this point, but perhaps it wasn't clear enough that I think other political parties or party groups or ideologies are experiencing from their own perspective the same kind of crisis. I just think that their integration, perhaps for the reasons that I tried to outline into more general modern histories, perhaps in the case of socialism, is perhaps a little bit better. But maybe that's just the introspective Christian democratic perspective on this. Yes, I do agree that the more we get away from purely looking at institutionalized context of politics and policy making, whether they're at the national level, whether they're government or parliament, or whether it's the European integration context or other context, the better. And your particular question about the role of religion in society and in public and in public debates, I think, is a particular relevant point. Of course, that's also informed, and that's perfectly legitimate, I think, by the contemporary experience of the fact that religion is so much more contentious again, ranging from the building of minarets in Switzerland to other such issues, and of course the Danish cartoon crisis and so on. It has to do with the sociological changes in European societies, which have to do with migration, with the role of Islam in Europe, etc., and the particular conflicts which are also international to some extent, of course, between radical Islam and European, broadly speaking, secularized societies. So I think these conflicts are very interesting, and they're not just interesting from a contemporary perspective, but they're also interesting from a historical perspective. I have done a little bit of work on the conflicts between anti-clericalism and Catholicism in the 19th century, and particularly, for example, the use of cartoons in this context in the 19th century. And the parallels are quite obvious, and I think there is potential for historians to look at periods, if you like, of culture wars, if you want to use that slightly contentious term, in earlier periods of time, such as the second half of the 19th century and the present day. And I think that would be really refreshing and would be perhaps a way to also make it easier for us to argue that history is indeed very relevant to understanding contemporary processes like these that you've discussed. So I'm with you on this particular point. I think this would be very interesting and important for us to make such a contribution as historians. On Piotr's point, of course, I understand that there are different traditions, by the way. They're not all American. You Americans always think that everything originates in the United States. There is a French tradition and Francophone tradition of looking at transfer, for example, as well as in inverted commas transnational history. So there are other origins, perhaps, of this particular type of approach. But I agree with you that this has been very interesting and very refreshing in many ways, and that it has also affected in your own work, for example, but also that of others, the way in which people look at the traditions of Catholicism. But I think that's to some extent surprisingly limited to the Anglo-Saxon world and to some extent the Francophone world, but has not really been applied to the history of Catholicism or Christian democracy in large parts of continental Europe and its research traditions, I would say. And I think here there is, of course, all those who've asked questions are well aware of these different research trends, but that doesn't mean necessarily that everywhere in every German or Italian or Polish university these new developments, relatively new developments in modern history and historiography are necessarily similarly received or practiced in any way. So I think the important thing here is for me that the connections in the academic world, for obvious reasons, are not so close between continental Europe and Britain and the United States, and that I think has led to problems in terms of receiving and innovating these different research trends. Funding, I have no model, of course, for this. I think it's obviously very fragmented. With the European Union, you have to show them that it indeed, as Antonio has just said, that it has contemporary relevance to solving the problems of the European Union, which are there's so many problems to solve. They want to throw all the money at the people who promise that they can solve their problems. I think the one way in which you will never get funding from the European Union if you just do work on one particular party or party tradition. That doesn't work because the Commission is very nervous about being seen as arbitrary in its approach to political parties and ideologies. So anything that you want to pitch at that kind of funding body, I think, has to have some kind of cross-political party or ideological orientation. There are other possibilities, but the problem again is that they sometimes exclude the United States. For example, there's cooperation among some European research or national research councils. For example, if you work in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, and Britain, then you can apply for funding for projects together on joint funding application, but that doesn't include Poland, for example. I don't personally know of any bilateral arrangements of the Polish Research Council with other research councils. Maybe they exist, but I haven't come across them. So this is highly fragmented, and there are some little programs with the United States which are usually bilateral between Germany and the US and so on. And so it's really difficult to build something up that has a more pan-European or even transatlantic broader scope. So there's really no solution to that, I think. And on Antonio's point, yes, I'm not so sure about the crisis of international history more generally, but I do agree, because it does go beyond the Cold War and European integration, but I do agree on both accounts that the Cold War history and European integration history, and the way in which they've been practiced in the past, that there is this widespread disappointment. The Cold War historians, of course, have the problem that the Cold War appears to have ended in the early 1990s. We have to rely on Putin to reignite it, and then perhaps there's more interest again in the Cold War. European integration, the one advantage it has is that the European Union still exists, so at least it continues to grow by a year every year. I think there it's perhaps the focus, I would say, but you know that that's my perspective on this, that if we focus too much on the institutional politics of the European Union, then it's difficult to integrate this more fully into the general historical development of Western Europe and now all of Europe, more or less, in the post-war period. And the more I think we can take this research strand out of this institutionally focused historiography into this wider history of Europe, the easier I think it will be to sell European integration as a significant force in that. I do think, however, and that is perhaps relevant also to the history of Catholicism and Christian democracy, that there is potential for looking at topics in a more global context where Europe also plays a significant role. You've alluded to the attempts at writing the Cold War in a global perspective, but I think even if you work on European integration, it's possible also to look at regional integration in a comparative perspective, for example, and there, of course, the European Union to some extent functioned as a role model as well in other places like Latin America. So I think there are still ways of looking at these kinds of research themes in an innovative way that can link it into trends of the history of globalization, for example, and others that perhaps are more en vogue in international history more generally. And then I agree with your frustration, of course, and I understand your frustration and share it, but I don't have a solution that increasingly there's less and less interest in understanding the importance of history, in fact, not just as history, which is what we as historians may find perfectly justified, but even for understanding present-day issues like those that Patrick has raised, for example, in institutions. And I don't know what the reason for this is. I think one is the extreme pressure of everyday problems that these institutions are facing, that they don't allow them to step back anymore and to take a somewhat more long-term approach to understanding policy formation and policy making as well. And perhaps it's also that there are just not a sufficient number of historians anymore. I understand, although I didn't actually follow this myself, that the former Polish Prime Minister, who is now the President of the European Union Council, actually recommended that students in Poland should no longer study history because they would just be unemployed after that. I mean, if a historian makes a remark like that, I think we are lost.
Thank you very much also for this last remark.